So let's delve into that a little bit further. So, why do parents react so negatively to boys' feminine sides in a way that they don't with daughters' masculine sides, especially when you're talking about young children? And I know this because the author that your textbook quotes, Emily Kane, in past classes, I've used her book, The Gender Trap. That was the book that I assigned. I switched it up on you for you guys, but see, even I do it for you all. So easy, right? Implicit bias, that language. But she makes this point that oftentimes parents could come up with some pretty good explanations about how it's kind of a good thing to have a semi-masculine daughter. They say things like, oh, well, it's good. She's kind of tough. That means, she won't take no mess off of people. Or like, oh, in today's day and age, it's great. She's into sports. There are all types of scholarships like that. Or they might even say, I'm glad that she's not, too prissy and too cutesy and not one of those girls that refuses to get dirty and be outside. They spin a much more positive story around daughters doing masculinity. Not so with sons doing femininity. And I'd like to really emphasize, we're not talking about even 13, 14, 15-year-olds, in which case it should still be okay. But we're talking about little kids, right? You have fathers and mothers getting sometimes very upset about, sons who want to play with dolls, or, sons who they catch trying on, their sisters' ballet slippers and dance costumes. And what Kane finds is, it is that role of androcentrism, that kind of just implicit bias where we believe that masculinity is more admirable, more valued and valuable in society in a way that femininity is not. But then, of course, for men also, it is kind of the role of homophobia, right? The fear that even in your 4, 5, 6-year-old son, this preference for femininity in some way is indicative of their sexual preference. And not only is this just silly, but the idea that that a parent would think that the best way to then address that is to, I don't know, shove football and trucks and stuff like that down their throat as a way to, I guess, squash their potential gayness. Everything about that is just wrong. But oftentimes, this is the more likely response in a lot of families, that Kane was looking at, more so than being accepting. And they were much more accepting for their, daughters. And, and this is why when we talk about the symmetries that exist, but in the gender binary, you could think about, this is why sissy and tomboy are not equivalents, because, the idea that a girl is a tomboy, there is still in that label some latent kind of like respect and like some good traits. And it's like, she's kind of tough and aggressive and she can play with the boys, and it's not 100% a bad thing. But you can't really look at a term like sissy and how it's used and employed by people and find a lot of positivity in that term. There is no upside, there is no silver lining to that term. And so, tomboy may not be fighting words, and usually is not a fighting word. And oftentimes, adult women will identify as being former tomboys during their child days. While in a lot of male circles, being called a sissy is our fighting words. It is upsetting. And a lot of men, if they identify as someone that was called a sissy, while growing up, it isn't like a point of pride that they say about themselves. Oftentimes it's tied to very hurtful memories. And that's because, to go along with that androcentrism, the primary masculine imperative, right? How do you know you're doing masculinity right? The number one way to address that is to avoid the feminine. And so avoiding the feminine, means that you need to avoid not just things associated with women, but there is this link between sexual orientation and gender expression. And when I say link, I mean link in terms of how people perceive and talk about it, not link as in a link that really exists. But oftentimes, for men who do not avoid the feminine, they are kind of attacked with slurs linked to either femininity or to homosexuality. And it's because we conflate femininity in men with gayness. And in a society where, especially for men, there is this compulsive heterosexuality, and like I said, just a lot of kind of negative perceptions around sexual fluidity in men, much more so than women. I see people say it on the internet all the time, that, maybe women can be bisexual, but, they don't believe bisexuality exists for men, which is, once again, just one of them kind of crazy opinions, but opinions that people really do have, and the type of thing that can really explain why, if men are seen as doing something effeminate, they will either be attacked along the lines of their gender identity or attacked along the lines of their sexual orientation. And therefore, this leads to that label of fragile masculinity. Because, as your book notes, being sufficiently masculine and avoiding femininity requires constant vigilance, extending to the most trivial things. And so if you aren't always constantly vigilant, you can be caught doing something not seen as being sufficiently masculine, and therefore labeled with either one of those slurs linked to femininity or slurs linked to homosexuality. And there was a hashtag that went viral a few years ago that really tried to make that point, and the hashtag was masculinity so fragile. And it just really tried to point out, kind of the ridiculousness of these kind of arbitrary masculinity purity tests, these rules. But you can see this in all types of places and spaces. And once again, I'm talking about contemporary society, y'all. And so I give you a couple of links if you want to check some of this out. The link one is to a BuzzFeed listicle, and it just kind of is products that are like ridiculously gendered and geared towards men. Because the idea being like, if this product wasn't labeled as being explicitly for men, then maybe it would be considered, effeminate or, too feminine. So, they market it and package it differently, right? I'm talking about the blue razors versus the pink razors, the body wash that smells like, I don't know, pine cones and sweat. Well, I don't know what male body wash smells like. Pine cones and musk versus the floral or sweet scents that women's body wash has. So that's just a list of some of those types of products and how they're really playing on this fragile masculinity to get men to buy them. The second link is an article that your book actually mentions: 10 drinks real men shouldn't order in bars. And oftentimes fragile masculinity is evident by this kind of emphasis over what real men should and should not do. There are always these rules about what they can wear and how they behave and what they should buy, and in this case, what they should drink. And sometimes this even pops up, of course, in ads. This is a Jim Beam ad that says Civil War soldiers getting their legs sawed off weren't given a vodka cranberry. So some really weird advertising here where, we're conflating strength with drink choice, but also amputations. Like, I don't get why this would be a, great copy for ad, but there it was in all of its appearing in a magazine glory. And then the final link is to a Dockers ad, which I frequently emphasize in my class because it's just so over the top. in its messages, kind of bolstering, this idea that there's this right way to be a man, and that, men should be constantly working to uphold it. And so, I normally read this out loud in class, but just take a moment here and read this and some of those themes. They talk about how little old lady men used to wear the pants, and little old ladies never crossed the street alone, and men took charge because that's what they do. And then they, right there in the middle, they start attacking like this modern like masculinity, and they characterize it in these very negative terms. So they say, but somewhere along the way, the world decided it no longer needed men. Disco by disco, latte by foamy non-fat latte. Men were stripped of their khakis and left stranded on the road between boyhood and androgyny. But today there are questions our genderless society has no answers for, and the world sits idly by as cities crumble, children misbehave, and those little old ladies remain on one side of the street. For the first time since Bad Guys, we need heroes. We need grown-ups. We need men to put down the plastic fork, step away from the salad bar, and untie the world from the tracks of complacency. It's time to get your hands dirty. It's time to answer the call of manhood. So, whoa, a lot to unpack here. So apparently men caring about their health, because they are, ordering a salad, men enjoying music, going to the disco, these are now things that are considered unmanly. That conflation of, the word heroes, grown-ups, with men, so are adult women not grown-ups? The idea that little old ladies can't cross the side, can't cross the street on their own, or can't get assistance once again from women. This ad, which at this point out, is probably about maybe 12, 13 years old. It is a good example of what I mean when I say that, that the imperative to avoid the feminine, because to not avoid the feminine is to risk having your masculinity assessed and deemed lacking. That isn't just in men's heads. So, when that hashtag masculinity so fragile went around, a lot of it was targeted towards individual men. But I think it's important as sociologists that we acknowledge, where does this fragility come from? It comes from a society that puts these type of messages in advertisements, in our media, and then of course those messages pop up in the prejudices and stereotypes and the biases that we have, men and women and in non-binary folk, all those ideas that we have in our head. And so one real impact of this, of this imperative to avoid the feminine, is what we talked about before: male flight. When men leave something, a context, because it's become too associated with women. It's become overly feminized. And so in this chapter, they've already talked about cheerleading. They talked about baby names, not a lot of male Leslies anymore. They talk about, occupations, and I give you 2 articles if you want to read a little bit more about that. But, there's been sufficient evidence that shows that, oftentimes if the jobs available are in female-dominated fields, especially if they are in the kind of low wage sector, a lot of men will remain unemployed as opposed to take those jobs. And you have to really ask yourself, why? What is the motivation behind that? We know historically nurses used to primarily be men, and then that changed. And along with it, the kind of professional perception of nurses changed along with it. And if you don't agree with me, about how male nurses are perceived, by at least some people. Think about that movie. What's it called? Meet the Fockers. That I think that was a later version, but maybe, yeah, the first one was called Meet the Parents. But I'm sure you remember Ben Stiller's character. He was a nurse, a male nurse, and his girlfriend, later she became his wife, but her father, who was like a retired FBI operative, he made so many jokes about him being a nurse. And one plot point that, all these years later, because that is not a movie that I've rewatched multiple times, but all these years later, it still sticks out to me, how one plot point was him trying to demonstrate, that he took the MCAT and had scores good enough to go to med school, but he chose being a nurse. And, why he felt like he needed to prove that is hashtag masculinity so fragile, right? The idea that he thought he had to bring in this kind of, his MCAT test scores to legitimate his decision to be a nurse, because being a nurse, while a perfectly good profession for a woman, is not seen as being as admirable of a profession for men. Another good example of a profession that has experienced that type of male flight, of course, are teachers. Similar to nurses, I mean, if you'd go back to the antebellum era, teachers were primarily men. We didn't start to see that rise of teachers being women until after the Civil War. And this was particularly, in the South, as they created the freedmen's schools for recently freed slaves. Those schools were originally taught by white women from the North, who then trained African-American men and women to teach at those schools. But then after working in those schools, they kind of established kind of a standing tradition of school teachers, particularly lower levels, being dominated by women, particularly white women. Your book notes that just education in general, not just our teachers, are predominantly women, but at high school and junior college and college, and even increasing numbers of graduate and professional programs, women are outnumbering men. And your book makes some really interesting arguments, about what might be the long-term consequences of education being associated with women and female traits like studiousness and responsibility. And so, that be a real man, uphold masculinity, it's encapsulated by that dominant model of masculinity. And that dominant model, and this is a term you've already learned, is hegemonic masculinity. But we're going to break it down, and this was the same slide that I showed before. You got your strong, you got your successful, you got your aggressive, you got your athletic, you got your heroic, you got your, outdoors, activities. All of those are kind of traits that we associated with manliness, this idealized version of manliness. But we're going to break the term down a little further. So when we say hegemonic masculinity, well, maybe the first question is, what does hegemony mean? And so that term is basically an idea. It's referring to an idea that is widely endorsed and accepted by the majority of society. And what's really important is it's accepted by those who benefit from the idea, but it's also accepted by those who do not benefit from the idea, who are perhaps even hurt by it. And so, it's this dominant model that has this wide societal level acceptance. And so if you want to think about, it in terms of something besides masculinity, then, capitalism is a good example of hegemonic ideology, right? So many people in America, strongly support capitalism, are really wary of socialist programs and state-sponsored safety nets, although, as all the memes say, is very true, most of us are much closer to being, homeless than we are to being billionaires. But for a lot of us, we support this ideology, even if it doesn't really benefit us all that much. A historical example would be something like slavery in the South. So many whites were not, in fact, slave owners, and certainly weren't large plantation owners. But the number who supported the slave system, even though that system is part of what kept so many of them poor, because if you are a poor farmer, you and your little farm that's only worked by you and your sons is never going to be able to compete with the plantation that has like 200 people working for free. But the idea that those poor farmers also supported the slave system, went to war for it, that's what's meant by hegemonic ideology. So if you apply that same type of thinking to masculinity, what does that mean? That means that the hegemonic man is the real man in our collective imagination. He embodies all of the most positive traits on the masculine side of the binary. And we hold this idealized image of this man in our head, even though we may not know a lot of men like him, or if we are men, we perhaps might not be a lot like him. But this is what makes it hegemonic, right? It's that idea of we uphold it even when we ourselves are not benefiting from it, and don't necessarily perfectly illustrate it. And so your book makes a really good point, and I did get the page number right for this quote, or this paraphrase, that just by membership in the category, all men get to identify with the characteristics we attribute to men in general. And this way, men do benefit from the hegemony of masculinity. So what I say about this is, I have two examples, from my personal life, and perhaps you can think of others on your own. Is I am athletic. I was kind of athletic in high school. I was really just a track runner, but certainly by the time I was in grad school, I got more into lifting, and I did the whole CrossFit thing for a while until I had some injuries, and now, of course, it's like a mix of like F45, Orange Theory, Pilates, yoga, like workout 5-6 days a week, and usually do 2-a-day workouts about 3 to 4 days a week. So, especially for my age, I am stronger and faster and in better shape, not just of most women, but also of a lot of men. I am amazed at the number of men that seem to go out of their way to brag about, men can, they can still do more push-ups than you, or, they're still faster. Men are still faster than women, or they're still stronger. Even though some of those men who are making that point are most definitely not stronger, at least if you're measuring it in terms of something like, I don't know, push-ups or pull-ups, holding a plank, and certainly not faster than me, regardless of kind of what you're talking about. But when they say that, it's not so much about whether they themselves as a man are faster or stronger than me, but the idea that the collective man, the ideal man, the hegemonic man would be faster than me, would be stronger than me, because athleticism and strength are qualities that the hegemonic man has. Another example is, I don't know if you know this, but, when you're in graduate school, doctorate program, you're like super broke. Like, you're living off of your stipend. Maybe you're living off a little bit of loan money. In my case, I was living off of too much loan money, which is why I have so much student loan debt now. But, the point is nobody has a lot of money. And when I was in graduate school, I dated a lot of other male graduate students. They always spoke about their future riches, watching out for these gold diggers. And I would always be like, this is somewhat ridiculous, because you are broke. You have the exact same stipend that I have, and we're in the same field. So we both are like on the same occupational track. And once again, noting professors are really just not the type of profession that should go around like bragging about their goal. But this kind of like watching out for the gold digger, this idea of like this success that they're going to have someday, once again, is kind of predicated on this idea of the hegemonic man, right? Yeah, they weren't going to grow up to be, Don Draper or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, but it's the idea that when you are looking at, our richest people in America, our top CEOs, our billionaires, Forbes billionaire list, the majority of them are men. And so even if you are a man who is never on that list, that kind of collective of like, watching out for gold diggers, and success and money, they're calling upon that hegemonic man, even if they themselves, based on their salary, make the same as their partner or maybe even less. And that's how it works, right? Because even if they will never be that successful, it's that idea that the most successful people are men, and they as men belong to that category. Now, your book does note that there are some negative traits that are included in the hegemonic ideal. Specifically, one they mention is being dirty, like, lack of cleanliness, and as well as like being bad with children, the opposite of nurturing. But by including these bad traits in the hegemonic man, it allows everyday regular men to offer accounts that your book refers to as exculpatory chauvinism, right? So, exculpatory chauvinism, break it down, it frees someone from blame, and then the chauvinism, it refers to bias in favor of men, and so basically it allows them to explain away bad behavior at the same time putting a spin on it. So, example, that I provide here is maybe a man saying to his female colleague after a meeting where he talked over her and shut her down, he might say something like, I spoke over you in the meeting because, men are naturally more aggressive. So that explaining away their bad behavior, by linking it to supposedly some innate, natural trait that exists in men, and even making this like potentially negative trait out to be like a larger positive. And in your book makes that observation that exculpatory chauvinism suggests that men are designed for dominance, right? So even something like being bad with children, that stereotype, that just means like, oh, well, I don't have to be nurturing, because, my job is really to go out there to make the money and be the head of the household. And that's a good thing, because you want the type of man that's powerful and aggressive and is out there making money, right? That's how that account would sound.